So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Data in the Greater Good. I'm Elaine Gamble, and we're honored to have with us tonight Charity Navigator, who will talk with us about giving during the pandemic and evaluating nonprofits at scale. Charity Navigator is the world's largest and most trusted nonprofit evaluator. And for nearly 20 years, its unbiased evaluations have become the gold standard, an indicator in the nonprofit sector. Its evaluations are data-driven that assess the financial health, accountability, and transparency of more than 9,000 nonprofits organizations, giving donors peace of mind about the organization they want to support. Also, that 9,000 will be expanded by the end of the year, and they will talk to us about that. We are honored to have with us the executive team from Charity Navigator, Kevin Scally, Chief Relationship Officer, and Matt Dragon, Director of Engineering. To briefly tell you a little bit more about them, Kevin Scally is responsible for building the Charity Navigator brand, awareness and advocacy, and increasing support. Before joining Charity Navigator, he was a leader at Smile Train, the world's largest cleft charity. He earned his bachelor's degree and master's from Monmouth University. And Matt Dragon, the Director of Engineering, he oversees Charity Navigator's development, database, and technical architecture. He has his bachelor's from Johns Hopkins in computer science with a minor in entrepreneurship and management. And prior to Charity Navigator, he worked for Johns Hopkins University. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers from Charity Navigator, Kevin and Matt. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Really appreciate this. And Elaine contacted us about 2 months ago and said, hey, would you like to come and enlighten people as to what Charity Navigator does? And we said, absolutely. And wish that we were all in front of you and running through this presentation in better times, and that the presentation has definitely pivoted as we have as an organization. So we're excited to share that, but just wanted to give a big thank you to Elaine for organizing this. She's been a pleasure to work with, and Bill for running the behind the scenes and making sure that we have a good recording that we can share with thousands of additional people who will be watching this later. So like Elaine mentioned, I'm Kevin Scally. I'm the Chief Relationship Officer at Charity Navigator. That does not mean that I'm particularly good in relationships. You can ask my ex-wife about that. But I oversee marketing, communications, and development at the organization, and I've been here for about a year. And Matt, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Matt Dragon. I'm the Director of Engineering at Charity Navigator, and I've been here for a little over 5 years now.
So like Elaine mentioned, Charity Navigator is the world's largest and most trusted evaluator of nonprofits. And so we kind of answer the age-old question of, if you want to give to a nonprofit, but want to make sure that your donation is used efficiently and effectively, how can you do that? And, a lot of, and we were even just chatting with Bill about this prior to the call, and he said, most of kind of what he hears is kind of word of mouth of, I donated to this organization, they're a good organization, here's what they do, but we're an unbiased resource for that. In addition to that, we consider ourselves a platform that provides donors of all sizes. So we have, core level supporters who are donating tens of dollars, and we have foundations who are donating tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, utilizing our tools and resources to guide their philanthropic decision making. And what differentiates us is there's no paywall. So donors don't pay for access to the information, and nonprofits do not pay any money to be rated either. It's a really important kind of cornerstone of Charity Navigator. We're also a wayfinding tool that helps donors avoid charity scams. And this is primarily what the media gloms onto. So the idea that there are bad nonprofits out there, or organizations that are trying to steal your money posing as nonprofits. We are kind of the validator of if you are an actual valid 501c3 nonprofit, and providing information on that organization. A lesser known aspect of Charity Navigator is our giving basket. So you actually are equipped with the ability to donate to multiple organizations in one convenient checkout through Charity Navigator. And we don't process the donations. We have an integration through Network for Good, which is the same processor that Facebook and many other platforms use as well. And there's no sort of added fees or anything like that. It's just kind of an extension of our mission. And we are the textbook case of small but mighty team. So Matt, if you move to the next slide, you will see this small but mighty team where Matt and I are standing next to one another, and we are 10% of the team. So a lot of people, because Charity Navigator does have a pretty good brand recognition, they think of Charity Navigator as kind of this massive organization that's maybe corporate funded, and couldn't be further from the case. We're 20 people and very lean and agile as humanly possible.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about who our users are at Charity Navigator. So the numbers are a little small. They're not super important, but we have a slightly majority female audience. We've had traditionally an older audience, and the 25 to 34 being the majority audience is only something that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years for us. And we attribute that to a lot of outreach we've done on social platforms in trying to sort of speak the language more, not talk about giving or philanthropy as sort of an older, stuffier topic, and to try to have more of a organizational voice. But even with that growth in the younger user base, we still are a majority desktop audience. We often see sort of during the workday that desktop ratio can even get up into the mid 70% of the users on the site. So we are a website, but we also cater to what can be sort of an older audience for an internet property.
Just a couple things to add on here too. So Matt's right in saying that this is data that's based off of the past 12 months. So we are definitely seeing an increase in younger folks who are coming to Charity Navigator. If you start to stack up those age demographics to the right-hand side, though, you do see that by and large, most of the visitors that are coming to Charity Navigator would be considered older in nature. And that generally aligns with the philanthropic sector, in that when you think about yourselves and people that you know, is that, you know, when you're in your teens or early 20s or, you know, even 30s, you have a lot of different responsibilities of paying for a mortgage and maybe you have kids at home and paying off college debt. And most organizations are seeing that donors typically skew older, you know, with an average age of about 57. Some organizations even older than that. And the reason for that, as you can imagine, is that, you know, you're at a point in your life where, you know, maybe you've paid for all of those other responsibilities and now, you know, can give back. So a big question coming into this is, you know, why are nonprofit evaluations especially important during times of crisis? So Charity Navigator typically sees a surge in traffic in and around disasters. So, you know, even just thinking past the past 8 months or so, is that we've experienced globally a lot of different crises. So, you know, you really start to think about Hurricane Dorian and the fires in California, and then certainly the fires in Australia, and a variety of other issues that have happened around the world. And kind of hopefully the capstone on that, and we won't continue to see more of those crises, is the world that we're all living in. So COVID-19. So the reason why you are seeing a move to charity, or an increased interest in Charity Navigator, is because of the fact that during times of crisis, it pulls at heartstrings, and donors certainly want to support worthwhile causes. They're seeing kind of this endless news cycle, and they want to see how can they actually help. In addition to that, you know, we consider nonprofits the safety net of society. You think about all of the programs that nonprofits offer of food insecurity and shelters and all of the things that the government doesn't, and nonprofits basically step in where the government falls short. So due to the current urgent circumstances, nonprofits have had to innovate and adapt, and there's an even greater need for continued and increased funding. And just to really underline that, we have some big, bold numbers here. This is from a study that we recently launched with Reuters. So because of the because of the contacts that we have for nonprofits, we can actually reach out to nonprofit leaders and get a finger on the pulse of how they're actually being impacted by different disasters. So we went out to our database of about 15,000 nonprofit leaders and had asked them how they're actually being impacted currently financially. And you can see that 83% are saying that they're currently suffering due to COVID-19. And of those, the projected decrease in revenue was 38% between the month of April and June. And then you're seeing this interesting confluence where it's just, this case of being asked to do more with less. So there's less funding coming in, but there's an increase in the amount of requests for services. So they're having to cut back on programs, but they're also seeing an increase in demand for those programs. So it's really put this weird kind of confluence of need versus funding.
So at Charity Navigator, as sort of at the cornerstone of people looking for charity and looking to help in these kind of situations, we've experienced since the beginning of March a 25% increase in site traffic. And along with that increase, we've seen over 240% increase in donations to other nonprofits through the giving basket that Kevin mentioned. And so we think this is a really important sort of disconnect between the statistics, because while we're seeing more traffic, it's not that much more. So the people that are coming with a greater intention to give than they would be not during a disaster. And this is sort of a common theme. When disasters happen, we tend to see the traffic go up and down, potentially as we get media coverage or people mention that we have a resource around donating as part of the disaster recovery. But what we typically see is those people that do come are that much more intent on giving. And so the amount that we see move through the giving basket sort of always outpaces the increase in website visits. And so since the beginning of March, we've had $4.4 million donated through the giving basket by over 15,000 donors, and that's gone to over 5,800 nonprofits.
And just one thing that I would add here is that of the $4.4 million, we've had about 1.6 million of that has actually gone to organizations that are listed in our COVID-19 hot topic. So these are organizations that have been identified that are providing relief and recovery to communities impacted by COVID-19. And typically when we're running a hot topic list, how that comes to be is that nonprofits are filling out a survey to us and indicating how they're supporting. They do have to be a highly rated organization. So based off their accountability and financial metrics, they need to be either a 3 or 4 star rated organization. They also need to have a dedicated fund that they're any money that they're receiving through the hot topic and our giving basket, as well as even on their site that they have a very specific gift policy. They have full transparency in how those funds will be used. Typically, we see about anywhere from about 5 to 30 organizations that will add to a list. Right now, we have about 115 organizations on the list. So for those of you that are of the design mind, you can see how that could quickly become a major disconnect in a donor landing on a landing page and seeing 115 different options of organizations to give to. So we've had to become strategic in creating sub-lists around different categories such as medical relief, supplies, education and awareness, and a number of others. And we're only surfacing the top 6 of those organizations on the overall landing page with a click through to the larger sub-lists as well.
And this is just sort of a high-level overview from Google Analytics of the traffic we've seen since the beginning of March. And this is synchronized up so that the day of the week lines up compared to last year. And you can see we as people sort of initially started sheltering, business got disrupted. We actually saw a drop in traffic sort of in early to mid-March compared to year over year. And then as people sort of got settled in their new routines and people started trying to sort of figure out how they could help now that their own situation was a little more stabilized, we started to see the increase in traffic. And if you go all the way to the end, as of a few days ago, we're slowly starting to come back down in terms of traffic numbers to where we were last year. But we're still seeing, as we'll go into in more detail on the next slide, an increase in donation year over year. So again, even though the news cycle may be burning people out, there may be less stories looking to feature supporting charities around COVID-19, driving less visitors to the site. The people that do come are still, primarily motivated about wanting to donate.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add here is that typically when donors have those heartstrings that are pulled on based off of what they're seeing in the news or what they're experiencing in their own lives, there's that immediate reaction of, oh, I want to go out there and do good. Now, disasters do see donor fatigue. So once the news cycles have ended and it's no longer kind of top of mind, or even just thinking through as to how the pandemic and economic shutdown is getting pretty tiring, and you're wanting you're seeing people wanting to turn back to a sense of normalcy, it does make sense that the charitable interests may decrease as well. And on the next slide, you'll see outline of giving here. So there's a clear correlation between the traffic and giving that we're seeing with some certain spikes. Most notably, there's an uptick in the end of March and into April, and we definitely saw a big uptick in the amount of media mentions that we were getting, and also just kind of feature opportunities as well. And our hypothesis here is, and we're going to do some surveying around it as well, is those folks who were donating during this time period, it could be that individuals were receiving their stimulus checks and maybe were relatively unimpacted and wanted to turn that to good. There was certainly a news cycle where you kind of got away from the doom and gloom, and they wanted to be news wanted to be focused more on acts of kindness and how people were doing good. And then there was certainly celebrities that were being very encouraging of being philanthropic as well. Most notably, Barack Obama was early to tweet out our hot topic list and include it in a newsletter. We also had features on Mark Maron's WTF podcast. Last week, we were included in a Mr. Show reunion with David Cross and Bob Odenkirk and a bunch of people from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, which was very cool. And one of the major spikes that I just want to call out and address, because I'm sure it's a question that will come up, is what the hell happened on May 5th? And it wasn't Cinco de Mayo, even though it was Cinco de Mayo. It was also a day dedicated to giving called Giving Tuesday Now. So some of you on the call may be familiar with Giving Tuesday. It's typically a day that follows kind of the commercial holidays of Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And it's a day dedicated to being philanthropic and giving to nonprofit organizations. And as the pandemic was making its way to American soil, the folks at Charity Navigator had said, hey, how great would it be if there was another Giving Tuesday that helped inspire giving? And we weren't the only ones who were thinking this. The people at Giving Tuesday, the organization there, came to us and said, would you be interested in partnering with us to amplify our efforts in hosting a day of giving in May? And we said, yes, of course. So we did see a tremendous increase in the amount of activity on that day as well. So this actually came across my desk, I think yesterday or the day before, and it was definitely a quote that coming out of the National Council of Nonprofits. So Rick Cohen said, "Nonprofits are facing devastation right now. Some are facing skyrocketing demands for their services. Others are seeing funding dry up, and some are seeing both at the same time." So this article was actually about how many small nonprofits may cease to exist due to the current situation. And this will be kind of the theme of the rest of the presentation as to how we are innovating and adapting to be able to better serve nonprofits of all sizes.
So this is a graph representing donations through the Giving Basket that were made over the past 12 months. And what we see when we look at these numbers is giving through our site, even though it's not sort of explicitly tied to a good rating from Charity Navigator, a bulk of the funding is going to 3- and 4-star charities. Those are the charities that Kevin mentioned get highlighted in a hot topic if there is a disaster or some other event going on in the world. And obviously we tell people that 3- and 4-star charities are charities that they should feel confident supporting. What we also see is about a quarter of the donations are going to charities that were not currently rated. And we've had the Giving Basket now since 2015. And what we've seen is that every year that not rated portion creeps up some. So as people sort of get more comfortable with using the Giving Basket, they start using it sort of as their one-stop donation platform. And so they start to add more and more charities into their giving through our site. But what we also notice here is we don't want people to just be giving to this subset of charities that sort of fit our criteria and we're able to rate, because that sort of 75% only represents 7,000 give or take nonprofits. So we're looking at how we can expand that pool of nonprofits that we can help people feel more confident in giving to.
Yeah, so we often hear from donors who will proudly tell us, they say, oh, I only support Charity Navigator rated nonprofits that are, at 3 or 4 stars. And we cringe a little bit because not being rated by Charity Navigator does not mean that you're not a gift-worthy nonprofit. In fact, I actually came from an organization that wasn't rated by Charity Navigator, and it was a very large organization, about $100 million annually. And I remember sitting next to the donor engagement folks and the phones being off the hook in around the holiday time periods of, why aren't you rated by Charity Navigator? Why aren't you rated by Charity Navigator? And, we do have criteria, which Matt will kind of briefly run through, that does limit the amount of organizations that we can rate, primarily based off of the financials, but also based off of the structure of the organization as well. So we don't want it to be a strike against hundreds of thousands of nonprofits not receiving funding. And you can think about the current situation where there's a food bank that's down your street, or a crisis center, or an animal shelter, that many people would say, I want to support them, but they're not rated by Charity Navigator. I'm not going to support them. So we want to make sure that we're serving, nonprofits as well as the donors who generally want to do good in the world. So this is a quote from our CEO and president, Michael Thatcher. And this really kind of illuminates of what the future of Charity Navigator is. So I'll read this aloud for everyone. Let's get to a place where we can care more about what the money has done than where it was spent. Exploring systems and approaches that help us do this are the future of evaluation for the social sector. So this is what I was mentioning before, the age-old question of how much of my money actually goes towards the cause. This will always be an important part of the equation, but it may not actually be the most important part. So Charity Navigator has certainly played a part in reinforcing this idea of overhead and how much should actually go towards the programs versus how much should go towards support staff and fundraising. So we definitely want to dispel that and start focusing more on program outcomes and ultimately the impact that a nonprofit is making in their target communities. So with new data and new tech, which Matt will run through, but certainly the challenges that we've been speaking on and everybody on this phone is certainly well aware of, for us, this leads to innovation and adaptation.
So we wanted to sort of highlight the difference between what we're sort of working on as a new experimental rating and the star rating of today. So today, charities are rated across 24 metrics. And in the experimental rating, that'll be a set of 5 metrics initially when we launch. And we really wanted to focus our first version of the experimental rating on things that we could rate automatically to allow us to scale data that we could get from the IRS sort of at scale and in bulk. And so that's limited the number of metrics we're using. But the more important thing we think in this initial version of the new rating system is that rather than rating the 9,000 charities we rate today, we'll be able to rate closer to 100,000 charities because we're getting rid of a lot of those eligibility criteria around the size of the organization or the structure of how they operate. And today, about 85% of the 9,000 charities we rate are getting a 3 or 4 star rating, which are the charities that we sort of recommend as a good rating. And so for the new experimental rating, we have an 80% target for those charities that will pass. So we're trying to sort of set the bar of passage at a place where about 80% of those 100,000 would pass this initial rating. And already we're seeing the growth of data that goes with the growth of those charity counts and the availability of much more data than when we started almost 20 years ago. So our current rating system has about 10 gigabytes of charity and rating data that we've accumulated over the last 19 years of rating charities. And already this new system has 120 gigabytes of charity data for the 8 years of data that we've been able to consume automatically from the IRS, and only 1 year of rating data, this experimental rating that we're working on. So it's already an order of magnitude bigger, and it's just going to grow from there. And as Kevin was saying, we really want to move away from the idea that not rated is a bad thing. So in the star rating, the charities under that rating system have about $22 million in average annual expenses. And under the experimental rating system, that's about $10 million. So we're able to rate smaller charities by limiting ourselves on the metrics for now. We're confident that we're rating those smaller charities fairly in a way that we couldn't do in the star rating system. And we're leaving ourselves room to grow and expand what goes into the new rating.
And Matt, just one thing that I want to quickly add just on that slide was that when we were talking this through with Elaine had said, "Ooh, 5 metrics, maybe you're not doing enough." And that is very top of mind for us. And we can certainly dig into what those metrics are during the question and answer. But we were very intentional with how we were approaching this, of thinking through, we want to be able to provide just kind of a preliminary check on scores more charities than we're currently doing. And thinking about it almost like going to the doctor, where there are certain things that the doctor will look at, of your pulse and your weight and your height and blood pressure. So just really looking at what are those core elements that we can build off of. We also found that there were definitely correlations in the metrics that we were looking at for the star rating that made it easier for us to slim down on what we were looking for the experimental rating. So just wanted to quickly add that before we move to the next one, Matt, but feel free to progress.
So under this new evaluation system, where we sort of started from scratch, we certainly have some comfort and some metrics that we liked out of the current star system that we brought over, but we sort of threw away all the preconceptions and tried to really look for a system that would allow us to evaluate a drastically larger number of charities. And in this initial launch period, we're looking at evaluating still on sort of the 2 axes of financial health and governance. But what we're really trying to build out in this new system is more of a framework that will allow us to slot in additional indicators, as well as change the metrics that underlie those indicators, and really build up over time a much more comprehensive assessment that has much closer to the sort of level of detail that the current star rating provides. And part of the model we're following is that we want to be rolling out these changes as on a regular interval. So we really wanted to get something out the door that we could test, that we could share with people, and then have that feedback process drive what went into the next round of changes.
Just to be very frank, when you think about the current situation that we're all living through, and how economically we know nonprofits are reporting to us they're suffering as a result of this, we don't want to continue to be just harping on purely financial health and governance data. We want to look at other areas of nonprofit effectiveness, because financials kind of go out the window. And we've been very proactive with our outreach to nonprofits to say, We know that you worry about your Charity Navigator rating. Don't worry, we're going to take care of you, and we're going to make sure that we take the current situation into consideration when we're actually doing our ratings. Now, the tough thing is we won't get the financials until a year after this is all said and done, based off of the IRS Form 990 cycles. But giving the reassurance to nonprofits now to say, make sure you're taking care of your people, so that way you can continue to serve the communities that you do, and also be forthcoming with the work that we're planning on and executing on as we speak, to look at these other aspects. So what are these other aspects that we're looking at? Financials, pretty straightforward, but do they demonstrate fiscal responsibility? Integrity is how we're looking at the current accountability and transparency metrics, and folding some other aspects in as well. Impact is basically the holy grail of nonprofit evaluation. So what is the actual history of success and impact look like? And then a much kind of squishier area of people. So what do their internal people look like? What does their strategy look like? What do some of their policies look like, which you'll see on the next slide, as well as even what is their reputation amongst employees, volunteers, and donors. So this is a possible new rendering of the rating system. So really what's being tested this week and going into next week is this idea of a numerical rating versus stars, and providing a top-level analysis that corresponds with the underlying metrics that live within that. We're calling those beacons. They're basically themed badges. But on the top level, we'd be able to have basically a pass or fail, and be able to signify that with some sort of word mark. One of the words that we're kicking around right now is gift worthy. And underneath that, having these different areas where folks would be able to understand what sums up into that overall rating. So finance, once again, pretty black and white as far as information pulled from 990 forms. Integrity, looking at A&T, like I mentioned. And then, the two new areas that we'd be building out in months to come, impact and people. And one of the things that I would add on to the underlying metrics that I didn't discuss on the previous slide is this idea of even diversity, equity, inclusion in internal policies and the communities that they serve. Right now, we're considering the idea of branding the rating system. So currently, we just have Charity Navigator stars. But moving this over to this Encompass rating to signify that the rating does encompass a variety of different items that are factoring into it, and giving organizations something where this becomes very portable, so they can take their score at the macro level, and then they could also brag about their scores for some of the underlying metrics as well. So, for an organization that wants to show that it has good people, they would then take the badge that they've earned for people and be able to bring that to other stakeholders as well. So what you're looking at here is a potential rendering of what a new profile page could look like for us. The organization's name here is actually a charity's actual name, and it just happens to be the longest name in our database. So we're using that. We sent this over to our UX designers to put this onto what a profile page could look like, and then clearly seeing what that might look like on mobile as well. And the idea here is that there would be kind of this nibble, bite, full meal mentality. And what I mean by that is that people that are visiting this page could see at a snapshot on the right-hand side as to what the overall score is, and that they've earned this idea of gift worthy. And then there would be these underlying metrics where they'd be able to click through and see a lot of data that would be below the fold. So they'd actually get a full understanding of what makes up those different metrics and where we're pulling that information from.
And this is another mock-up of search results. So about 40% of our page views in a non-COVID time period are actually search results pages. So we recognize that a lot of our users search for a charity that they already came to the site with the charity in mind, and they're looking for a very high level takeaway of that charity's performance. So we're really thinking hard about how all that detail that can come from all those different beacons can boil down to sort of a single search view to give people a snapshot of that charity's performance.
So, we're acknowledging that there are certainly a lot of challenges with going down this route. Like Matt had mentioned, that currently our rating system is based off of machine readable information, but also has human eyes on it. So we have 6 full-time analysts who are going through what information nonprofits are making publicly available and providing ratings based off of that. So in aggregate score. Scaling up, we lose that human aspect. So we know that there are times where we're going to get it right, but there's also going to be times where we get it wrong. And we just have to be prepared for that. And it certainly comes with a bit of a customer service issue as well, in that we are such a small staff. I think the real challenge here, though, is that we do have the ability to illuminate smaller nonprofits who need funding now more than ever. So this kind of goes back to the whole theme of this, is how are we evaluating nonprofits differently come COVID-19. So we know that we've done the proactive outreach to nonprofit leaders that we're currently rating, but once again, we want to make sure that we're serving nonprofits of all sizes. The other thing that you can imagine is, like Matt said, is that a large portion of our traffic is going to search results, and that could be somebody plugging in an organization's specific name, or maybe a general category where they wanted to see dog charities. This is kind of a sample one that we typically use in the office, and you'll see all of the organizations that we've categorized that correspond with dogs. Now you have a lot more options. So you could have it where donors become very overwhelmed with the amount of nonprofits to choose from. And we really need to think about how we're incorporating new data sets and create filtering that allows donors to still pinpoint organizations to support. Now, we also need to establish new data partnerships and develop infrastructure to support data from more sources. So right now, we're primarily looking at one source of the IRS Form 990, as well as our analysts who are gathering information. But if we actually want to start absorbing information from folks who specialize in these other areas that we want to start evaluating, that can be cumbersome in itself, as well as we need to create a mechanism for nonprofits or volunteers to be able to provide information to us, thinking through it almost like a Wikipedia model where information can be crowdsourced and built upon. And this also kind of illuminates that the current situation, there's populations that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so we're looking at organizations based off of information that's available from tax forms, but not necessarily directly from the communities that they serve. So we really think it would be extremely powerful to be able to overlay need assessment information. So we know that supporting a nonprofit that is serving communities in Newark, New Jersey, or Camden, New Jersey, is probably there's a much higher margin of impact than there is for organizations that are serving communities in Beverly Hills, California. And so really appreciate everybody's attention and going through this. And I know we maybe went a little bit longer than the 30 minutes that Elaine had asked us to, but it's definitely something that we're really passionate about. And I think that there were a couple questions that came through. But like Elaine had mentioned, if folks want to take themselves off of mute and ask questions, we'd be happy to entertain them and answer them to our best ability.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive discussion. We do have a few questions. I'm going to start with Hillary. If you could just unmute yourself. You had a couple of questions, one related to the expertise and staff areas in a nonprofit, and the other related to the mix of visitors on the website. Do you want to speak to your questions?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you so much for such a clear and informative talk, Kevin and Matt. I was wondering if you could describe, early in your presentation, you talked about your brand voice and your ability to increase younger users through cultivating that. I was wondering if you could describe who, in terms of the job title and expertise and other responsibilities, manages that brand voice and how quickly that segment of traffic increased.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to speak to that. So I oversee the team. So it's marketing communications, and then the other half is development. Development is primarily focused on dollars and cents for Charity Navigator. We are actually a 501c3 organization ourselves. So we're kind of in this interesting world of being a nonprofit that isn't, pulling at the same heartstrings as, organizations like St. Jude's or Smile Train from where I came from. But on the marketing and comm side, we have a director of marketing communications, and we also have a marketing assistant. And the marketing assistant really has been integral in building out the younger audiences. So we had been previously relying on external social consultant who was really good and out of California, and did a very good job of kind of repurposing evergreen content on our website and content that was being built internally and leveraged for a blog and other kind of editorial areas of the site. But it really didn't humanize the brand at all. So one of the strategic initiatives when I came into the organization about a year ago was bringing that in-house. So we're having that consultant who's working out of California, but having internal team member who's dedicated to building out social. And the way that we've been able to do that is really kind of show that there are people behind the scenes like Matt and I that are working at Charity Navigator, and we're not all buttoned up all the time, and we can have some fun. And then in addition to that, engaging directly with our stakeholders in a variety of different ways. So we've launched a Facebook Live series where we're inviting nonprofits to come on and share how they're innovating and adapting during the current pandemic. So I feel like it's ramped up pretty quickly. Our marketing assistant has probably been on about 3 or 4 months, and we've seen pretty tremendous growth in the amount of social following. As far as the analytics that we're seeing, I would say that that's primarily over the past 2 years, we've seen about a 2% increase in that area that Matt had eliminated, which is pretty substantial when you look at it across all of the different demographics.
Thank you. Hillary, you had another question as well about the mix of traffic.
Yeah, I wondered if you have a sense for how much of the total traffic on the site is prospective donors as opposed to staff from private foundations, philanthropic organizations, as opposed to the staff from beneficiary charities.
So the general feeling is that the primary audience that's coming in is what we would consider core level donors. So typically the average gift through our giving basket is in around $90. We've seen about a 30% increase in the average donation size during the pandemic. But that is really kind of the core Charity Navigator user. So Matt, I don't know if you have kind of more thoughts on a percent breakdown, because most of the traffic that is coming into our site is anonymous. We do have functionality to be able to log in, but even then there's not necessarily kind of this self-selection of nonprofit staff versus foundation staff versus kind of core American donor.
Yeah, I would say a lot of that sort of search result and exit traffic is going to be some level of donor or sort of interested external party. I know there are foundations that do use our site, to do some of their sort of initial vetting of potential grant recipients, and they're more likely to be diving into the details of those charities, as I would guess are the charity sort of employees themselves. So I would imagine a lot of that sort of search and go traffic is either donor or prospective donors to that charity, or there's some interesting long tail uses of the ratings, like around people who want to vet an organization before they volunteer, people that want to check the rating of an organization before they apply for a job at that organization. So some of that may be not quite donor, but certainly individuals represent a large portion of the site traffic. If just sort of anecdotally, we don't really have a good analytics data point on that.
And Hillary, just to add on to that, so Charity Navigator being a 501c3 organization as well, many people think of us as funded primarily by infrastructure foundations. And we certainly do have some support there, but about 80% of our donations actually come from individuals with an average gift in around $60. So I would think that there'd be kind of a correspondence between Charity Navigator, like site visitors versus donors. So that might kind of be a good direction to be able to answer that question with more certainty.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Travis. Travis, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, this is Travis here. Just wanted to quickly thank you all for this presentation. It was very informative, and I appreciate you all being willing to share this information with us. So I had a question kind of looking back at that 240% increase through the giving basket. Of those 1,500-ish donors, do you all have any idea of how many of them were new donors to that process?
We have the data. I don't have the answer off the top of my head.
That's okay. I was just curious. So yeah, so I'm trying to get into the fundraising field, and I'm really interested in the idea of engaging donors and working with donors to teach them about the donation process and educate them on them so that they can, better enhance their experience. So I was just curious if you saw any new traffic at all.
Yeah, we one thing I would say is typically a hot topic driven donation is a donor that has not used our site before.
Okay.
So we do tend to see sort of new adoption of the giving basket in times of disaster giving. And then we do tend to see those users sort of come back to do more sort of year-end giving or more regular giving after they've found the giving basket.
Awesome.
But we will have our emails up at the end, so if you want to shoot us an email, I can definitely share that data point. I just don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That'd be awesome. Appreciate that.
Travis, I also think that there's kind of an interesting kind of sub-question. So it's like new donors to the giving basket, and then the other kind of interesting idea would be new donors to those organizations, right? So how many of the total donors are supporting organizations they've never supported before through the giving basket?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have another question from Lucas. Do you want to unmute yourself? Lucas, are you there?
Yeah. Hi.
Okay. Hi.
So I just wanted to know what happens when you don't have a data point. So for example, when evaluating that overall metric, if you don't actually have data to sort of to cover all those points, what happens then? I imagine like smaller charities will probably have a lot less reporting versus the larger ones.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that, and it's actually something that we, if we had more time, we would have dove a little bit deeper. So I'm glad that this question came up because it's been something that we've been tossing around internally too. So I think the initial response is that they, by and large, organizations would not be penalized for not having data. We know how hard it is to collect data just from 9,000 organizations. If we're scaling up to 100,000. You can't then say, well, because we don't have your data, you're going to get a lower score as a result of that. I do think that there could potentially be some bandings that are put in place to say, if you're a $100 million organization, you probably should be publishing your results and we should be able to score that. And if you're not publishing that, then that maybe seems a little bit fishy. But when you think of that compared to an organization that's maybe raising, $100,000 or $250,000 a year, they can't have those same level of expectations. So it's kind of an answer on both sides. So, I'd say by and large, we're not going to penalize, but there could be cases where we do say, this is a requirement based off the type of organization that you are.
The other thing we've talked about is thinking of it more as like a journey for the nonprofit. So the first year we rate you under this new system, maybe you won't lose any points for not having things, but then we want to sort of give you tools to help your nonprofit build out some of these practices. So help you build out a logic model, or help you build out, what kind of inputs and outputs should you be measuring as the type of nonprofit you are, and sort of make it so that year over year, it gets a little bit harder for the nonprofit to score the highest scores, but doing that for data points and items, not just that we're interested in or we want to display on the site, but for practices and things that we really think are best practices within the nonprofit sector.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go back to Travis because there was another part to which you wanted to ask, Travis. So I want to make sure we cover that.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you two would be able to expand at all on how you are measuring impact. To me, it seems, really difficult to define, what is doing good work, but something that's really important to me for the nonprofit sector to start addressing, of kind of how we get this, global definition of good and impact. So I was just wondering if you all could talk a little bit more about your ideas behind that.
Sure. And Travis, you're definitely not the only one. Everyone has been spending a lot of time in trying to figure out, how do you actually crack impact and rate it at scale. So right now we are surfacing impact information on nonprofit profiles, and that extends above and beyond the 9,000 that we rate. We have about 30,000 profiles with impact information. And that's coming from a variety of different sources, which includes Candid, which owns GuideStar and Foundation Center, Impact Matters, used to include Classy, and a variety of others as well.
Global Giving is the third one
as well. Yeah, and we've kind of labeled these as the impact partners, and we've felt that this is very important information to surface to donors while they are navigating their giving. So take that into consideration while you're looking at their Charity Navigator rating and the underlying metrics. I think initially what we're looking at doing is looking more at like impact transparency. So are you providing partners with that information that can surface on Charity Navigator's site? And then we do think that for service-based organizations, you can start scoring based off of the answers that they're providing to the partners. So specifically for GuideStar, they have suggested questions based off of the type of organization that you are. So that way you can be benchmarked compared to your peers. So if you are going that route, then it becomes a little bit easier to evaluate you against another organization. The other area, and I kind of alluded to this in the last slide, was this idea of margin of impact as well. So there's certainly reported outcomes, and you can look at the populations that are served, because serving 5,000 people in one community is very different than serving 5,000 people in another community, depending on the size of that community. So those are the types of things that we're currently looking at. Matt, anything else you'd add to that?
I just want to share the pain of sitting on multiple hours of phone calls debating whether or not we could even use the word impact with those impact partners. Round and round, is it impact, is it results, is it something else? So it's definitely still an open question in the sector, and even within the groups we've chosen to partner with.
Okay, so we're right at the hour now. So again, I want to extend our sincere thanks to Matt and Kevin for a very comprehensive discussion. Really, really appreciate this. And if there are any other questions, the presentation, a link to it will be sent because we're recording it, and it will have the contact information, I believe, for Kevin and Matt.
Put that up.
Yep, you can reach out to them directly. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight, and please join us next month. Have a nice evening.